Over the past few weeks, we have been discerning and discovering what matters most in our lives. As part of our current sermon series, we have been rethinking our relationship to work and to money, to God and to one another. We've explored how we can live lives that are reoriented, so we can live in ways that allow us to rest, to seek justice, and to experience joy. Last week, the Reverend Eric Garbison preached about the time when the Hebrew people were enslaved in Egypt. He talked about how Pharaoh would not allow the Hebrew people to rest or to worship God. As Eric noted, we all have inner pharaohs in our heads, voices that tell us to do more, to work harder, to never, ever, ever stop. We each have these inner voices that keep us enslaved to the market and separated from one another. And we have this inner Pharaoh voice whether we want to or not. And I agree with Eric that we have these voices in our head. In fact, as a one, I have it pretty strong. But I think we also have another voice in our lives, and that is the voice of God that dwells in our hearts. The voice of God that tells us you are loved, you are enough, you have a purpose, you can rest, you can play. The voice of God that tells each of us you belong. This week we'll look at how we can listen to the voice of God in our lives and to discern the work that God calls us to do. God calls each of us to sacred and holy work, not to prove our worth or to improve our wealth, but to better the world, to bind up the brokenhearted, to create beauty, to liberate one another. This holy work is our vocation. Our scripture passage for today comes from, as Jimmy mentioned, 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 through 13 and 15 to 20. If you're here in the sanctuary and you'd like to read along, you can do so by opening up one of those blue books, one of those Bibles. 1 Samuel is part of the Hebrew Scriptures, and it is named after Samuel, one of the book's main characters. Raise your hand if you've heard of Samuel before. All right, excellent. Does anyone know what Samuel's father's name was? All right, that's okay. I'm going to help us out with a little bit of this. So his father's name was Elkanah, and his father was married to actually two wives. One was named Peninnah, and Peninnah was a woman who was able to have many children. And the second wife, her name was Hannah. Raise your hand if you've heard of Hannah before, right? We know Hannah. So Hannah for a long time was barren and not able to have kids, and she was just filled with sorrow and deep, deep grief. As she saw Peninnah able to have children, her grief and her sorrow continued to grow. So one day she went to the sanctuary overwhelmed and she prayed to God. She prayed to God, and in her prayer she promised God that if she was granted a child, a son, she would dedicate him to God's service. So after praying to God, Hannah returned to her home, and she and her husband had sex and they conceived a child. And Hannah named her son Samuel, which means the Lord has heard, or I asked the Lord for him. When Samuel was weaned and old enough, Hannah kept her promise and took Samuel to the priest, who was named Eli, and said, "Eli, this is my son, and I am turning him over to you so he can serve God." Now Eli, the priest, had many sons at this time, and they were up to no good. They were abusing their power and privilege and failing to love God and others, and this did not go unnoticed by God. So Samuel shows up as a young boy and is taken under Eli's wing. And Eli takes care of Samuel as Samuel lives with him and assists with the priestly duties. However, God has more planned for Samuel than simply being an assistant. This is where today's scripture passage begins. A reading from 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 through 13 and 15 to 20. Friends, let us hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Now the boy Samuel was serving the Lord under Eli. The Lord's word was rare at that time, and visions were not yet widely known. One day Eli, whose eyes had grown so weak he was unable to see, was lying down in his room. God's lamp had not yet gone out yet, and Samuel was lying down in the Lord's temple, where God's ark was. The Lord called to Samuel. "I'm here," God said. Samuel hurried to Eli and said, "I'm here. You called me?" "I did not call you," Eli replied. "Go, lie down." So Samuel did. Again, the Lord called Samuel, so Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "I'm here. You called me?" "I did not call, my son," Eli replied. "Go and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the Lord's word had not yet been revealed to him. Interesting side note. A third time the Lord called Samuel, and he got up and went to Eli and said, "I am here. You called me?" Then Eli realized that it was the Lord who was calling the boy. So Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down. If God speaks to you, say, 'Speak, Lord. Your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down where he had been. Then the Lord came and stood there, calling just as before, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel said, "Speak, your servant is listening." The Lord said to Samuel, "I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of all who hear it tingle. On that day I will bring to pass against Eli everything I said about his household, every last bit of it." Samuel lay there until morning, then opened the doors of the Lord's house. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision from God to Eli, but Eli called Samuel, saying, "Samuel, my son." "I'm here," Samuel said. "What did God say to you?" Eli asked. "Do not hide anything from me. May God deal harshly with you, and worse still if you hide from me a single word from everything God said to you." So Samuel told Eli everything and hid nothing from him. "God is the Lord," Eli said, "and God will do as God pleases." So Samuel grew up, and the Lord was with him, not allowing any of his words to fail. All Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was trustworthy as the Lord's prophet. May we receive holy wisdom from this holy word. Friends, thanks be to God. Early last year, millions of workers began voluntarily resigning from their jobs. Middle-aged workers who were counting down to retirement, recent college grads who were just starting out, leaders who had been at their companies for years left their jobs. Not just a few workers here or there, but millions of Americans, a record number. Economists label this exodus of employees the Great Resignation. People's reasons for leaving their jobs varied. Many women were forced to leave their jobs because of responsibilities of caring for young children and aging parents. Other workers left to switch fields and pursue passions or to find jobs that offered more of a work-life balance. Still others left as an act of resistance. Fast food workers left their jobs that failed to pay them fairly for the labor that they did. For many Americans, the pandemic called them to reconsider their lives, their work, and how they spent their time and energy, how they spent many of their waking hours. This sermon series, What Matters Most, comes at a fitting time. It's a time where people in our communities, in our nation, and around the world are asking this question: what matters most? It's a time where people are rethinking their identities as workers and their relationship to work. Last week, before the worship service began, I was talking to Eric Garbison, and he shared that his daughter Diana is graduating from college this year, and after I got over the initial shock that she was a college senior, which seemed crazy, I asked him the dreaded question, which is, what is she going to do? It is the same question of work that we start asking people at a very young age. What are you going to do? What is your profession going to be? It's the same question that we often refer to when we're meeting people for the first time. When we meet someone, what is one of the questions that we ask? What do you do, right? It's a shorthand way of trying to get to know one another, but this shortcut often makes our identity tied up into our professional occupation. It makes our professional identity our primary one, and it teaches us to see ourselves and others through the lens of the market and to focus on what we do and equate it with who we are and what we're worth to society. Our work and our identity get bound together. What do you do? It's a question that the world places a lot of value on, and it's a question that we in the world, myself included, often fall back on. But as Christians, our faith invites us to ask a different question. The word vocation comes from the Latin word vocare, which means to call. Vocation in the Christian tradition refers to the work that God calls you to do. We often hear the word vocation used in relation to pastors. When I began my ministry here at Second, I didn't talk about beginning a new job, but of receiving a new call. And yet, vocation, God's calling, is not reserved for clergy. Rather, God calls each and every one of us to sacred, holy work. God has a deep purpose for each of our lives. God knows and calls every single one of us to use our gifts and live in ways that deepen love and that cause justice to bloom and joy to burst forth. For Christians, the question is not, what do you do? But what is the work God is calling you to? The theologian and writer Frederick Buechner writes about vocation in his book, Wishful Thinking. He describes vocation as, quote, the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. The place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. For Buechner, vocation sits at the intersection of two questions. What work brings you deep gladness, and how can this work meet a world that is deeply hungry? What work brings you deep gladness? Vocation asks, what is the work that you must do? Not because you're good at it, not because others have told you to do it, but because it is the work that makes your soul come alive. Because it's the work that you can't imagine not doing. What is the work that brings you deep gladness? Vocation asks this question, and then it asks this other one, which is, how can this work that you're called to meet the world's deep hunger? Vocation notes that the world is longing for love and hungry for peace and hoping for joy and seeking belonging. Vocation asks, how can the work that you do meet this hunger? How can your work nourish others? Vocation sits at the intersection of these two questions. What work brings you deep gladness, and how can this work meet the world's deep hunger? Each of us have a different answer to these questions because each of us have a different vocation. But it is the same God who calls each and every one of us. On that night, Samuel lied down on his mat, curled up into a ball, waiting for Eli's heavy breathing to turn into gentle snoring, a sign that he had finally fallen asleep. Just as he was dozing off, Samuel heard a voice call out in the night. Expecting it to be Eli's, he runs to his mentor's side. Eli tells him to return to his bed. He didn't call. Samuel runs to Eli's bedside 2 more times, and on the 3rd time, Eli recognizes what Samuel cannot, that the voice of God is calling him. And so he tells Samuel to return to his mat and to listen. Samuel lies back down, and when he hears this voice again, he takes Eli's advice and responds to God, saying, "Speak. Your servant is listening. Samuel listens for God's voice and hears God call him to share God's word with God's people, including Eli. To be a prophet is not easy work, and yet in this work, God is with him. For many of us, the pandemic has called us to rethink our relationship to our jobs and to reconsider what matters most. In this season, perhaps we are called to consider our calling, not simply our careers, recognizing that our vocations look different in different seasons of life, and that our vocation may or may not be the same as our day job, what we're paid to do. So how do we find our vocation? How do we find the place where God is calling us to? How do we find the work where our deep gladness and the world's deep hunger are met? I'd suggest that Samuel's call story, the scripture passage that we heard today, offers 3 important insights for discovering our vocation, the work that God calls each of us to do, to bring joy and justice to the world. Discovering our vocation, as the story suggests, begins first with listening. Finding God's call for our lives starts with listening. Samuel's posture is one of listening and openness as he waits for God's Spirit to speak. Samuel listens and responds to God saying, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." Finding our vocation, the work that God is calling us to do, starts with this same openness. It starts with this willingness to listen to where we may hear whispers of the Spirit in our lives. For some of us, we may hear God speaking most clearly when we are cooking meals for others. For others, we may hear God's voice while we are playing jazz music that brings people together. Still others of us may hear God's voice while we are digging in the dirt at a local community garden. The work that God calls you to will likely be different than the work that God calls the person sitting next to you. That's why we have to start with listening, to hear how God is uniquely speaking to each of us. Discovering our vocation also involves discernment. Being able to discern which voice is really God's. In the story of Samuel, Samuel struggles to recognize God's voice. He's accustomed to hearing that of Eli's and other voices who tell him what to do and who to be. So too, we have many different voices in our lives. Our parents' voices, our partners' voices, our own internal voices, voices that remind us not to be afraid, voices that tell us we need to do more. Discernment is the work of judging well, of being able to determine which voice is God's. If you're wondering, how can I hear God speak? May I suggest turning to the voices of the people around you. Community can play a crucial role in this work of discernment. God speaks to Samuel, but Samuel does not recognize God's voice, and he confuses it with Eli's. It is Eli, his mentor, who helps Samuel to discern God's voice in his own life. This reminds us how community, friends, and others can help us to hear the places where God is speaking. If you haven't heard God speak to you, and if you are asking, what am I called to do? What is my purpose? I invite you to talk to others, to ask family and friends where they see you come alive and how they feel deep gladness radiate out of you. Community can help us to recognize our gifts and hear the ways that God continues to speak. The third thing that I would suggest is an important part of vocation, is not only finding what we're called to do, but responding to this call, responding with a yes. After Samuel listens and discerns it is God who is speaking, God shares a vision with him, and it's not a fun vision, it's a vision of a word of judgment that God is asking him to speak. Samuel is called to share this vision with Eli, and he hesitates, which I think makes him a little more human, but he ultimately responds with yes. God calls each of us, but also gives us the option to say yes or no. Finding our vocation is the first part, fulfilling it is the second. Vocation involves taking a risk and responding with a yes to God. Yes, I will go where you lead me. Yes, I will be open to this scary, risky, wonderful thing that you are calling me to do. Vocation sits at the intersection of these two questions. What work brings you deep gladness, and how can this work meet the world's deep hunger? It starts with listening, it involves discernment, and it requires a response from each of us. I want us to continue to think about this idea of vocation, not only to consider our careers, but also our calling. And so to do so, I want to invite two people who I think have some good wisdom to share, to talk about their sense of call and how they have heard God speaking in their lives. Steve Moore is a teacher and career navigator at Summit Ridge Academy in Lee Summit, and Laura Laney is a local midwife. And so let's give them a round of applause as they come forward to share with us today. Well, thank you both for being here. So when I was thinking about this idea of vocation, you both came to mind because you are both in very demanding careers, especially right now with the pandemic going on. And are two people who I've heard really speak on social media and elsewhere about your sense of call and vocation. And so I'd love for you to share, what is your sense of call? How have you heard God calling you to the work to become a midwife and a teacher? What's that journey been?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks for having us, Kristin. So I first really tuned into midwifery in nursing school. So I'd been a nurse for 10 years before becoming a midwife. And in nursing school, my favorite course was maternal and infant health. And so during that term, that fall, I reached out to a nurse midwife here locally, Deb Bersano, and asked if I could shadow her. And so I shadowed her just for even half a day and fell in love with it. I thought it was the coolest job ever. And so from that point onward, I couldn't read enough about midwifery and kind of that midwifery model of care. I couldn't watch enough. I couldn't talk to enough people about it. So I fell hard for it. So I knew eventually I would hope to become a midwife, but I wanted to be a nurse first and kind of get that background and experience. So was a nurse for about 7 years and then decided to go back to grad school to be a midwife.
Great. Yeah. What about you, Steve? How did you become a teacher?
So I started my college journey as a chemistry major and spent a lot of time in the lab and thought I wanted to be a pharmacist or work as a chemist in some research capacity. And it was only when I was a teaching assistant the summer after my freshman year that I found this new calling. Really, it was a calling because I had a mentor teacher who I worked with, and he was not only an incredible, scholar and researcher, but he was an incredible teacher. And through watching him work and getting the opportunity to be one of his students, that was brought about to me, and I got to live alongside him as he taught everyone with compassion and care that I hadn't seen in that way before, kind of only being in my own head as a student, kind of only thinking about myself. And he taught everyone, with the same sense of vigor and duty, no matter if they had a D in the class and came once a week instead of 3 times, or if they were on their way to med school. And so that really spoke to me, and I became kind of activated by that. And so through his mentorship, and then later through speaking with my wife, I found a way to, instead of kind of whittling my square peg to fit into the round hole and being disappointed by that, I listened to her call, and she said, this is for you. You need to do this. This is your calling. So took those two people.
Very neat. And I wondered too, so often with vocation, it involves some type of risk of being able to say yes to what God's calling us to do and no to other things. What were some of the risks that you took in deciding to become a midwife or a teacher?
Yeah, so one big risk was just financially. I was comfortable in my lifestyle. I was a nurse for 7 years. I was confident in my nursing role. I'd gotten through that newbie phase and loved what I did. So it was definitely risky, or felt risky, to kind of step away from that and into the unknown in terms of transitioning from a nurse into the provider role, which has a lot more, obviously, responsibility and autonomy, but kind of morphing into that new role definitely felt risky. And then financially, backing down from that income, that steady income and that comfort definitely was a risk in terms of what the 3-year program would look like and where I would have to live, to go complete the clinical coursework. So those were just a few of the risks.
What about for you, Steve? Any risks that you felt you took? Yeah.
I think the risk for me was not in becoming a teacher initially because I was still young, but taking the job that I have currently, working in the alternative school. 5 years ago, I was an honors English teacher and had a pretty established set of habits and a program in my school, and felt kind of on a certain track, and I was very busy, and I was very engaged, and I was very, self-centered, and thinking about all the things that I had to do for my students, my program, in some cases my numbers, and I spoke with a friend who thought that I would be perfect for this job with students who had kind of fallen out of, really having a relationship with school. And that was a risk to even consider applying for that job and thinking about going through a shift in my career. And I spoke with my wife about it, and she said, "I'm not going to tell you what I think." She said, "Okay, do you want to do this?" And so she put it back on me, and it wasn't until after I interviewed with the principal of the school that I'm in now, and kind of had that resting. She said, "Okay, now do you want to hear what I have to say?" And I said, "Yes." And it was the right fit because I had to take that leap and really know that I was just going to do it for myself, in a new way, do something different, and it was a leap of faith.
Yeah, absolutely. Has the pandemic changed or challenged your sense of call?
It has definitely challenged my sense of call. Mostly just being a healthcare worker, in the pandemic, obviously we're almost to the 2-year mark, and every one of our lives was uprooted in terms of that sense of normalcy. But being a healthcare worker, especially in the last, I would say for me personally, the last 3 to 4 months, I just feel like I'm hitting that point of burnout, and so trying to stay focused and kind of navigate that path. Personally and professionally, just, talking about the great resignation, so many people in healthcare right now are leaving, whether that's because they're burnout or they were going to retire and so they're retiring early, or they're sick. The number or the reasons are endless, but we're definitely feeling that pressure right now. And so that's definitely challenging my sense of vocation. I love what I do, but just trying to figure out how to get through these next however many months of unknown until we get through this.
Yeah, absolutely. What about yourself, Steve?
So in education, it's been a pretty bumpy road as we go through just a series of unknowns, and parents have done this too. But had I been in my previous job, I would be trying to find engagement through grading and numbers and trying to make sure that student performance is how I measure my success. But I was fortunate that I was moved into this new position and was able to, even in this pandemic and these trying times, to think about students just as their own well-being as human beings first, and that was kind of the ethic that I was able to live through. And so it was still very hard for a lot of reasons, but I feel fortunate that I'm in a building where that is the most primal or of prime importance, and so that made me reflect back on my own life too. And so thinking about how my teaching and the time that I give to my students, if I balance that right with them, that I can do that for my family as well.
Yeah. And so what keeps you grounded? In those moments where you're going, okay, why did I get into this? Or God, what are you having me do? What keeps you centered?
A lot of things keep me centered. Mostly, I think, currently just trying to take off the hat of being a midwife or a healthcare professional, take off that hat, protect my evenings, and in terms of just recharging and having the space to do so and get that energy back, so then I can go to work and hold space for people who, need that support. So yoga, I've really loved the last couple of months. Running, spending time with friends and family and my niece. Also, just now that I've been a midwife for about 3 years, thinking back to families and clients that I've worked with, and just really special memories and lessons that I've learned through that relationship has really been cool to take me back to that moment of this is why I'm doing this, even though it's really hard right now. It's worth it.
Very cool. Yeah. What about yourself, Steve? What keeps you centered and connected to your sense of call?
Saying no to the right things so that I can say yes to the right things first. And the shift in my career was a big saying no experience for me, and that paid off a lot. And so creating space in my life for the people that matter and the work that matters, and really just making sure that I'm focused on how I'm able to be present with people, whether that's my students or my family or myself. And I think that I was shortchanging myself in a lot of ways in the last 10 years in my profession, and the last 2 years I've spent with a therapist, and that's been really helpful for me, and it's encouraged me to spend more time giving space for my needs so that I can then think about others in a way that's it's more real, and that's been a huge thing. And I have yoga, running, a lot of space centering activities, and sometimes it's just me sitting in my car in the morning for 10 minutes and breathing, and that may be prayer, that may be reflection, or it may just be a nap.
Yeah. So lastly, do you have any words of advice or guidance for folks who are trying to discern their call or navigating it during the pandemic? Any wisdom or advice to share?
Well, so I guess it could be pictured as advice. It's just a little story that sticks out in my mind from my time in Texas. So in 2020, like right before COVID exploded, I moved down to Texas to work in a birth center really close to the border of Mexico, and I loved it. It was the best experience of my life. But I think back to this moment, we had a lot of Spanish-speaking clients, and so in labor, it was a birth center, so I was out of hospital birth, so unmedicated, and so in labor, there were so many families that I helped where the mother, is in labor, and there's a point in labor when they're transitioning, and they don't think they can do it. Tears in their eyes, they just feel hopeless, and so they so many times would say, no puedo, I cannot. And so I'm not a great Spanish speaker. I'm trying to get better, but I learned very quickly the phrase, sí se puede, yes you can. So now, like, random moments, even last week at work, on hard days or hard seasons, that phrase always pops back into my head, and just that moment of we all kind of lose hope in certain situations, and knowing, like, hopefully there's someone nearby holding space for you and can remind you, yes, you can do it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah.
I'd add, too, that I said I'm really fortunate to be in an environment with my work that I'm able to give the space to students and to myself that I need, so that I have that balance, or I can find it. And I would say to other people, especially other teachers, like, not everyone is that fortunate. And so you may have a job and others are telling you that it's your passion, it's a calling, but really they're asking you to be a hero martyr and give of yourself in a way that you can't. And so you may not have a calling, but I think that if you can't find the calling, the space in your work as a teacher or as a nurse or a midwife or anything else, that you should find a way to say no to things in that job, or say no to the job itself, and that can be freeing.
Yeah. So remembering yes we can, and where to say no and where to say yes. I want to say thank you for both of you for sharing today. Let's give them one more round of applause. Thank you. Maybe Susan. So as we continue to think about vocation, I invite you to consider not only your careers, but your calling. What has God placed in your heart? What gifts has God given to you? How can you use your life to not only find deep gladness, but to meet the world's deep hunger? As we continue to reflect on our sense of call and vocation, let us do so as we listen to our anthem this morning. I'm going to invite the choir to come forward.